So we're going to start the first session of the afternoon, and I have the pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Annie Larivée, who I got familiarized with her work many years ago, and it's very exciting to meet here in person for the first time. Annie Larivée discovered the work of Pierre Hadot and of the late Foucault on ancient philosophy as a way of life and care for the self, while doing her master MA in philosophy at the Université de Montréal in the late 1990s. The intellectual encounter durably impacted her academic trajectory. In the early 2000s, she earned a PhD from the Sorbonne with a dissertation titled The Political Asclepius, Care for the Soul in Plato's Dialogues. Since then, she has published extensively on related themes in ancient philosophy, particularly Plato, both in English and French. Her current research aims at refining our understanding of what philosophy was and could still be, possibly, by distinguishing ancient conceptions of philosophia, which are related but distinct, such as philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as an art of life, philosophy as therapy, philosophy as care for the soul or the self, and philosophy as contemplation. She has served 2 terms as chair of the philosophy department at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where she lives and teaches. And today she will be presenting a paper with the title Philosophy as a Way of Life in Classical Antiquity. The stage is yours. And the
Okay.
red is what?
So is this okay? Yes? All right. Thank you, Heather. So I faced a recurring issue while working on my chapter over the summer. I had so many ideas, but when I tried to arrange them together, many seemed not to belong to the same body. It felt a bit like the cosmic cycle described by Empedocles when odd creatures made of random limbs are wandering around. So at one point, I decided to set myself rules to unify my thinking. One rule led to another, and I ended up with a series of 8 maxims, which is what I will share with you today. You will see that they are very simple, but to my surprise, following some of these maxims generated new ideas, some of which transformed my views on classical Greek philosophy and on PWL more generally. So as a sign of appreciation, I decided to refer to the whole series as my Octopharmakos, which is also a modest tribute to Epicurus, of course. So here they are. First, remember your assignment. By assignment, I mean the goal expressed in the original title that our volume editors gave me. This title is PWL in Classical Antiquity. It is not Philosophers' Views on PWL in Classical Antiquity. What this maxim is getting at is that the object of my inquiry should be the concrete reality of PWL during that period. Reporting on major philosophers' opinion on what philosophy was or should have been is not enough. The challenge is to shed light on a real-life practice as it was experienced by real human beings in Greece 25 centuries ago. Concretely, what that means is that I should not limit myself to the representations of Socrates' life found in Plato or Xenophon, say. I should also attempt to shed light on Plato's way of life, on Xenophon's way of life, on Aristotle's way of life, as well as on the life of all other individuals who participated in philosophy one way or another, most of whom are unknown to us, of course. Don't get me wrong, I am interested in what philosophers say about PWL in the text that survived. And luckily for us, there are many. But my first maxim reminds me that interpreting those texts is not the end, it's a means. Now you may think, wow, that is one ambitious goal, but it sounds naive and unfeasible. Evidence is scarce, and ancient reports on philosophers' lives are dubious at best. We would need a time travel machine to know what philosophy was really like back then, and we don't have one, obviously. This leads me to my second maxim: use peripheral vision. While ruminating on my first maxim, I realized that we do have something like a time travel machine at our disposal. This time travel machine is the Platonic corpus, but the Platonic corpus approached in a certain way, with what I call peripheral vision. Typically, Plato scholars look at the dialogues with a philological microscope and other sharp tools to extract what they judge to be most important from the texts. Using peripheral vision is the opposite of that. It means ignoring what is at the center, arguments, ideas, main characters, to pay attention to what lies around, little things, little facts, all sorts of details mentioned in passing, such as the presence of a crowd attending a discussion, the material used, the space where it takes place. Secondary characters modern readers tend to ignore or despise, and so on and so forth. With that method, dialogues are a gold mine of information. They reveal so much about philosophy as a lived practice, and we can be confident that the information is accurate. And that's because there is no reason for background facts to be misleading when considered at a high level of generality. Here's an example. Let's take Plato's dialogue called Parmenides. If you read it, you know how abstract and complex it is. Not exactly the type of text PWLers are usually fond of, but the prologue offers interesting information about philosophy as a shared social practice. At the beginning, the narrator, Cephalus, informs a friend that someone named Antiphon entirely memorized the discussion that took place decades earlier between Socrates, Parmenides, and Zeno. Cephalus and a few companions made the trip all the way from Clazomenae to Athens to hear that account. Now, if we approach this scene with a historical scalpel, we can doubt pretty much everything. We can doubt that the discussion between young Socrates and Parmenides happened, or that Socrates ever met Parmenides at all, or that a specific individual named Antiphon, who was Plato's brother in real life, memorized the discussion in his youth. This could all be literary fiction. What we can hardly doubt, however, is that such things in general were done. No one expresses surprise when Cephalus mentions the purpose of his trip, or that Antiphon memorized this discussion. So we can infer that it was nothing extraordinary at the time. Such things were done. Some people would be so curious about past philosophical encounters that they would get on a ship and cross the Aegean Sea. Some discussions were deemed so meaningful that regular people would memorize them and share them on request as if they were human books. I say regular people since we learn in passing that Antiphon is now spending all of his time with horses. And Cephalus describes his companions as mala philosophoi, an expression which can't be accurately translated in English since the noun philosopher can be combined with adverbs like very, which is the meaning of mala. Nowadays, either you are a philosopher or you are not, but back then, it could be a matter of degree, it seems. And there are many other places where relevant info hides in plain sight. So here's a funny example. If you go on Amazon, you learn that the 2 volumes of Aristotle's complete works in the revised Oxford translation total 2,512 pages and weigh no less than 3.23 kilograms, which is over 7 pounds. Now, the title Complete Works is misleading since this is not even close to what all that Aristotle wrote. We know through ancient lists that it represents only something like 1/5 of his total production. This means that had everything survived, we would have something like 16 kilos of Aristotle to go through. Holy cow. This observation sounds very peripheral indeed, as in trivial, but it allows us to make meaningful inferences about Aristotle's way of life that are pretty much certain, regardless of the evidence found in doxographers, such as Diogenes Laertius. Things like he worked a lot. His daily life was very industrious, intentional, almost frantically active. Also, his life was not a solitary one because there is no way he could have done this all alone. The empirically informed part of his work required the contribution of many dedicated collaborators, which also means that Aristotle had solid leadership qualities and organization skills, not to mention a lot of stuff and space to keep that stuff. And this is just a sample of safe inferences we can make. It is important to use these solid inferences as reality checks when interpreting what Aristotle says about theoria as a bios, theoria as a way of life, includes way more than the ultimate phase of contemplation with the passive and solitary tones of the English word. Rather, as the Greek word and institution suggest, the life of Theoria is a long, labor-intensive journey one undertakes with a group of fellow travelers. Theoroi were civic ambassadors sent abroad as observers at religious and athletic festivals. Their mission had different stages: preparation, travel, observation, diplomatic activity, travel back, and submission of final report. I wouldn't say that Aristotle's texts are the intellectual equivalent of travel literature, but there is a similarity with the final account that Theoroi were expected to share upon their return. My third maxim is also methodological, but it has to do with hermeneutic self-awareness. So third, disenmesh relational perspectives. Enmeshment in psychology refers to relationships with boundary issues. I think it is safe to say that at this point in time, PWL has a bit of an enmeshed relationship with ancient philosophy. It is understandable since it owes its very existence to Hadot's work on antiquity. Most PWLers turn to ancient philosophy for inspiration and as a source of legitimacy. This is all fine. There is nothing wrong with that, unless, paradoxically, one's goal is to gain historical insight into PWL in classical antiquity, like me. In that case, that pre-existing investment can be problematic. So to disenmesh things, let's distinguish between two relational perspectives. First perspective, there is what we, country PWL enthusiasts, find relevant and exciting in ancient philosophy based on our own situation, interests, and needs now. Second perspective, there is what pushed ancient Greek philosophers to conceive of philosophy as a way of life, a bios, and to advocate for it 25 centuries ago. These are very different perspectives, and two very different chapters can be written on PWL in classical antiquity, depending on the one I choose. If I were to select the first, there are so many fascinating spiritual exercises I could explore, so much material in Plato that remains underexploited by contemporary PWL, but I must remember my first maxim and stick to the second perspective. Obviously, entirely bracketing one's own situation to observe the past is impossible, but we can reduce enmeshment by contrasting historical contexts. What about the present context? In our current context, PWL works as a meta-philosophical paradigm. The debate is internal to philosophy. It involves an opposition between a certain kind of philosopher who consider practice and exercise essential and another kind of philosopher, the academic type. The use made of this paradigm is critical, antagonistic. PWL challenges a dominant model. And finally, the final objective is transformative. So our context, metaphilosophical, intraphilosophical, critical, transformative. The ancient context is different. In classical Greece, discussions on PWL are not, or not primarily, metaphilosophical. The debate is not internal to philosophy. We don't see philosophers who see philosophy as X challenging other philosophers who see philosophy as Y. Rather, philosophy is described as a bias to contrast it with other ways of life, such as the life of politics or the life of pleasure. So the Greek debate on PWL opposes philosophers and society, or it is social, it is cultural, political. Finally, the objective is mostly defensive and protreptic in the context of a fight for recognition. Philosophers are responding to attacks. They want others to acknowledge the value of PWL, and they are trying to recruit. This context is different from ours, and despite commonalities, it is also different from the context in the Hellenistic and Roman period. This leads me to maxim 4, don't confuse prescription with description. Most ancient texts in PWL, in which PWL is a theme, belong to the normative and prescriptive genres. It is the case of eulogies, apologies, comedies, protreptic discourses, and of political reform programs, for instance. Such texts praise, attack, defend, exhort, or prescribe a course of action. Their goal is not to investigate or inform. It is to affect people's opinion and even change their whole way of life in the case of protreptic texts. It is important to keep that in mind because many texts sound descriptive. They say PWL is this, PWL is that, but these texts are strategic and involve idealizations. They do provide information, but mostly on philosophers' hopes, challenges, and ambitions. And they also showcase their formidable persuasion skills. So when we read the fragments of Aristotle's protreptic, say, we must remember that what we find there is not a mere description of what PWL was, or even of what Aristotle thought it was. For example, the argument that one should embrace philosophy because it is easy is a bit perplexing in light of Aristotle's organon. Protreptics were the equivalent of recruitment prospectus. Many philosophers wrote protreptics. Sometimes they are titled protreptics, but sometimes they are called the Gorgias or the Republic. Newsflash, the pedagogical program defined as the central books of the Republic is not reality. It doesn't represent the life of philosophers in the so-called academy. Of course, we know that, but we tend to forget because Plato's description of philosophy are so darn powerful and inspiring. Let me give you one example of what can happen if we forget Maxim 4. Let's talk about conversion, a phenomenon dear to Hadot. We find many analogical descriptions of conversion in Plato's dialogues. Think of the allegory of the cave in the Republic or the ladder of love in the Symposium. Scholars endlessly scrutinize these stories to understand Plato's metaphysics or his epistemology, his psychology. I am absolutely convinced that Hadot is totally right to question such projects given the genre of these texts. But for the exact same reason, I think that we must question Hadot's conviction that these images describe what philosophy was really like in Plato's time as a lived experience. We cannot have it both ways. What I'm getting at is this. When we encounter texts like the allegory of the cave, say, it's tempting to conclude things such as, in ancient Greece, becoming a philosopher involved an epiphany followed by a conversion of the soul and a complete transformation of one's way of life. Well, maybe, or maybe not. We need to be careful with such extrapolations. One thing is certain, though, and I'm sure many of you can confirm this from experience. As a teacher, when you present these allegories to undergrads in class, it's like magic. Eyes start to sparkle, dead fish come back to life. Many students stick around after the class. They cannot get enough. The effect is so powerful that it's scary at times. Some even decide to switch their major to philosophy, which I don't necessarily always think is a good thing. It's an intriguing psychological phenomenon, but images of conversion seem to have a mimetic power, and I think Plato knew that. Another risk with the topos of conversion, and more generally the description of philosophy as a way of life, is that it makes philosophy an all or nothing type of thing, and also a forever ever after type of thing. A fine ideal, but that must be considered as such. This leads me to Maxim 5. Don't let maximalist ideals blind you. The long version is, don't let maximalist ideals blind you to the whole spectrum of philosophy's role in people's lives. Thanks to peripheral vision, I started to really see, as in appreciate, an increasing number of characters with different levels of commitment to philosophy in Plato's dialogues. To do justice to reality in all its diversity, I propose adopting a spectrum with two poles, one minimalist and the other maximalist. And there are also different ways to be a maximalist, a minimalist, or to be in the middle. It's a work in progress, but let me mention a few types I identified. At the maximalist end of the spectrum, we find figures like what I call the missionaries, figures like Socrates, Pythagoras, and later Epicurus. There are also the theoretics, characters like Timaeus, Theodorus, and the Eleatic stranger in the dialogues, or Plato and Aristotle in real life. And there are also exuberant figures I call the zealots, followers of Socrates like Chaerephon and Apollodorus, who emulate his way of life, and later the cynics like Antisthenes, who had been a follower of Socrates, and Diogenes. For maximalists of all types, philosophy and bias are coextensive. Philosophy is pretty much a full-time pursuit, and there is not much outside of it. This will create social challenges for maximalist philosophers. What about the middle of the spectrum? This area is especially interesting. It includes people for whom philosophy plays a substantial role, although not all-consuming or permanent. For some, a certain level of dedication persists throughout life. For others, intense commitment to philosophy is a phase. We probably wouldn't describe people in the middle of the spectrum as philosophers nowadays, but some of them show remarkable dedication to philosophy, and it could well be that philosophy could not have existed socially without their contribution. I suggest referring to the middle as the region of philo-philosophy and philo-philosophers. Philosophers are lovers of wisdom, and philo-philosophers are lovers of philosophy, and perhaps even more of philosophers in some cases. Philo-philosophers include types such as the supporters-sponsors, think of Crito, Socrates' old friend. The keen, think of Cephalus and his friend mentioned earlier. The recorders, like Antiphon, also mentioned earlier. The promising recruits, Alcibiades, or people like Xenophon in real life. The allies, people like Nicias in the lackeys. I skipped the minimalist poll for lack of time, but I could mention the frenemies, like Callicles and the Gorgias, or Plato's rival Isocrates. Understandably, as PWLers, we tend to be fascinated with the maximalists. But considering the whole spectrum matters because it gives us a more realistic and comprehensive appreciation of philosophy as a social practice. Also, maximalist assumptions often mislead us, hence Maxim 6. Don't confuse maximalism with universalism. We tend to interpret maximalist philosophers' statements on the good life in universalist terms, as if they were on a mission to convert absolutely everyone to PWL. This is not very plausible, and it leads to absurdities. Here are two examples. The first deals with Socrates' exhortation to care for the soul. The second with Aristotle's praise of theoretical life. If there is one Socratic injunction, which is unambiguous, it is Socrates' invitation, addressed to all, to prioritize the care for the soul. Now, one widespread assumption is that this exhortation to care for the soul is an invitation to adopt PWL. According to Alexander Neamas, for example, Socrates is a universalist who wants to, I quote, to prove that a single type of life is best for all people, end of quote. Socrates would be on a mission to convert everybody. This is such a common view, but it leads to absurd consequences. Let's try for a second to imagine a polis made of 30,000 Socrates. It is comical, but more importantly, it is unsustainable. It would definitely make human life abiotos or ubiotos, unlivable in more than one way. But there is an alternative. Let's accept the two following propositions as true. First, Socrates exhorted all to adopt a hierarchy of values where all things soul, knowledge, wisdom, and virtue related are at the top. Second, Socrates was not hoping to convert everyone to a life maximally dedicated to philosophy. There's a way to make this work. Namely, Socrates did not think that adopting a life maximally dedicated to philosophy is the only way for humans to embrace a hierarchy of values where all things souls are at the top. Care for the soul takes different forms depending on souls. This makes sense. After all, it's easy to see that a society in which science is a top value is not a society in which everyone is a Marie Curie or works in a lab. Similarly, when Aristotle explains in his lectures on ethics that the happiest way of life is one dedicated to theoria, there is no reason to infer that he's trying to convince everyone in his audience to become full-time theoreticians. Affirming that philosophers win the Olympic of human flourishing is not the same as encouraging everyone to adopt PWL. In his Nicomachonetics and Politics, which form a whole, Aristotle is addressing legislators in training. So it could well be that he believes it's important that future lawmakers acknowledge the value of philosophical theoria. The hope is that legislators will then make such lives possible in the states they establish and ensure that philosophers are socially respected and valued, just like the civic ambassadors called the theoroi. perhaps even materially supported, although he didn't need that, but others did. My last two rules can be summarized with the meta rule: bring clarity by making distinctions. 7, distinguish Socrates' way of life and his project of an art of life. Let's get back to Socrates. It becomes easier to apply my previous maxim if we distinguish between Socrates' odd and unique way of life on the one hand, and Socrates' more general and, yes, in fact, universal project of an art of life on the other hand. According to Plato and Xenophon, Socrates is the one who launched the search for the art of life, which he sees as a techne in care for the soul. He urged everyone to acknowledge the importance of that expertise, to seek those who possess it or attempt to develop it. Now, it just so happens that Socrates also has a very atypical way of life. He walks barefoot, he always wears the same cloak, he neglects his own affair, he spends most of his time in public spaces interrogating people, and so on and so forth. That's his way of life, his bios. But Socrates never says that he lives that way because that's what the good human life consists of. He doesn't say that being poor and rarely bathing is the way to go for humanity to flourish. Rather, here is what he says during this trial, as depicted by Plato. He explains that his life is the way it is because he's on a mission assigned by God through the Delphic oracle. But that mission is very specific to him. Needless to say, not everyone is a God-sent gift. And Socrates himself emphasizes the singularity of his situation. The point I'm trying to get across is this: there is no conclusive reason to believe that Socrates' own life pattern constitutes the art of life he was promoting. But this view is so widespread and has a long history. It actually started while Socrates was still alive, with the maximalist group I call the Zealots, who imitated Socrates' life pattern. Later, the Cynics radicalizes this mimetic approach. With them, walking barefoot becomes walking around naked. Not worrying about cleanliness becomes doing one's business in public. Inspecting people becomes insulting them, and so on and so forth. As Plato once said, Diogenes is Socrates gone mad. But let's face it, Socrates was highly memeable. And the implicit reasoning behind the Zealots' mimetic strategy seems to be, who needs expertise if imitating Socrates' bios does the trick? With that creative mistake, they inaugurated what I would call WLP, way of life as philosophy. Although the first WLPer was probably Pythagoras with his Pythagorean bios. But another Socratic lineage rejected WLP. Theoretics like Plato and Aristotle didn't share Socrates' financial precarity. They had plenty of sandals and cloaks, and they didn't see the philosophical point of parting with them. However, there is one feature of Socrates' bios they found philosophically irrelevant. Like him, they considered schole, freedom as leisure, an essential requirement of a life maximally devoted to philosophy. More importantly, the theoretics heard Socrates call for an art of life loud and clear, and they went to work. Where can we find Plato and Aristotle's art of life? In their political works, which for Aristotle includes his Nicomachean Ethics, which is anything but a manual of self-care. Indeed, there is strong textual evidence showing that both understood care for the soul as the responsibility of politike techne or episteme. This is the expertise or science capable of producing human flourishing, not philosophy per se, which is not a techne, and has a much wider field of application than just human affairs. Philosophia is a disposition of the soul, not a techne. Meanwhile, politica techne cares for the souls by providing moral education to all citizens through legislation. This art of life is very different from the individualized approach found in the Hellenistic and Roman period. In the classical age, there is no PAL or philosophy as an art of living to speak of, I think, or only at a very embryonic stage. This leads me to my 8th and final maxim. In general, distinguish between PWL and PAL. Words matter a lot in historical inquiries. And in classical Greece, there is a clear difference between a description of philosophy as a special bias, better than and incompatible with other ways of life, and the Socratic project of an art of life. Today, when we describe philosophy as a way of life, the way of life part acts as a positive qualifier. But philosophers in the classical period didn't think that philosophy being a way of life was what made it good. In Greek, bios and zoe are not intrinsically normative. Everyone has a bios, a way of life. Meanwhile, the concept of techne, or art of life, is intrinsically normative. It expresses the confidence that a certain knowledge can make life good by contributing to human flourishing. It is also exclusive, since a techne is not something that everybody has. Although all will benefit from its existence in a given society. Think of medicine as a paradigm of epimenetic expertise in Plato. I cannot expand on the distinction between PWL and PAL, but it is crucial from a historical point of view. And if you are curious about my arguments, I will refer you to my text that was included in the volume that Elder and Marta edited and published last spring. So that concludes the survey of my octopharmacos. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the chirurgical precision with the time. It was
Yeah.
right on point.
Yeah.
We have 10 minutes for discussion, and Annie asked us that each question would be asked and answered in turn, so we'll follow that model. Yes, please, Pablo. Just a moment. No, Pablo.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really fascinating and very convincing also. I particularly liked the peripheral vision. I think it's very useful to have such a vision and very instructive also. You mentioned the possibility of arriving at safe inferences. And I was wondering, like, surely, I mean, how do you determine whether an inference is safe ultimately? I was wondering if you have like any methodological procedures to arrive at a safe inference or an unsafe inference. So I was just wondering about that. And yeah, furthermore, I just look forward to reading your text.
Honestly, as I said at the very beginning, this octopharmacos generated new ideas. So myself, I'm in the process of assessing these ideas and how they work. You ask what convinces me, or if I have a method to distinguish between safe inferences and inferences that are less safe. I don't have a method, but in the context of Plato's dialogues, I would say, as I mentioned, if it's background information and, there's no reason for this to be mistaken. If Plato writes that there is an audience attending a discussion, for example, why would he lie about that? There's a general fact. There would be audiences listening to Socrates and his interlocutors. This is important information. People would stop in the street and gather around and listen to this. So yes, of course, did that specific discussion take place? No, I cannot say, I cannot attest to that. But if it's just mentioned in passing and nobody in the dialogue expresses surprise about that, I think it's safe to infer that these things in general were done. Oh, yes, in gymnasium, yeah. 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 Yes.
What can we infer safely from that particular heat? You mentioned places, as an example, you mentioned places. So I'm very fascinated by the idea of ancient Greeks wrestling with each other and
Yes.
people engaging in that practice. But can we what can we safely infer from that?
In that case, I'm just thinking out loud. This is a public space. So philosophy is not something that is isolated from the life of the polis. It's out there for everyone to see, to hear, and to get an interest in. I was talking about that with Eli and Laura during the lunch. There's this book by Lynch on Aristotle's school. What's the title again? Anyways, yeah. Oh, it's such a good book. And he mentions that the academy, we tend to think of the academy and the lyceum as institutions. And, you know, there's a building and then there's this group. The academy was a sanctuary. It was huge. There were armies rehearsing there. It was like a gigantic park. And then, yes, at one point, apparently Plato purchased a small house. But before then, they were talking and discussing in the you know, this place that was around the gymnasium, well, what you mentioned, the palestra. They were just meeting up there. They bumping into one another, and then they're starting to discuss. And he mentions that there were perhaps rooms that they could be rented. So it's not as if they owned it. It's just like there's a room there, and oh, we're gonna use it. So this means that philosophy is not as an isolated thing at the time. It's a social practice. It's widely available. It's public. People can take part in it if they so wish. It's not exclusive. Yeah,
That's the full.
it's awesome. This book I recommend. It's older, but
For the people online, that's what is it? John Lynch, Aristotle School, a study of a Greek educational institution by John Patrick Lynch, like 1972. Though I think Matteo said there's another one on the school, right? You can't remember. There's one other.
it's oldie but goodie.
Thank you, Annie. That was delightful. I'm wondering if you think there's also a spectrum between philosophy as a way of life and philosophy as an art of living, similar to the spectrum you were making between the maximalist ideals and the more minimalist ideals, or is way of life just something very specific? I know in your book chapter, you specifically say, well, way of life is very specific. There are material conditions, there are very particular practices versus the kind of more open-ended art of living. So are you thinking about this in terms of, you know, it's a way of life, and if it's not fit within like atypical practices, everything else is an art of living, or is there some kind of spectrum that you're working with?
Okay, so you forced me to kind of think on my, how do you say that in English, on my feet?
On your feet.
Yeah. I think, as I said, in the classical period, there's no philosophy as an art of life to speak of. There's an embryo of it that we could talk about it, but I mean, I will try to focus on your question. Is there a spectrum when it comes to philosophy as an art of life? We will have to look at the Hellenistic and Roman period. And then what could that be? That would mean that, okay, there's this Epicurean recipe and someone kind of applies it sometimes and not all the time, or they're starting to apply this in their life, but they're still not totally committed to Epicureanism, whereas others are, you know, all in and trying to perform each and every action in their life according to this recipe that is Epicurean or Stoic. That's what I could see, but it's not as enlightening, I think, as the idea of spectrum is not as useful from what I can see right now. I'm trying to think about it as it is when applied to philosophy as a way of life.
Can I ask a follow-up? Do I have time
Or
for
you
that?
can tell me what you think.
Well, I'm thinking about, I know that you mentioned this at lunch, like you think this distinction is very useful for philosophy in antiquity, but maybe not as applicable to us. And I'm actually asking it because I think maybe this distinction could be useful for like thinking about ourselves as academic philosophers, because in one way, we might say we do have a particular way of life. We have special language. We operate on a completely different calendar year than everyone else, right? Some people might describe academia as a cult, and I'm not totally sure that they're wrong about that. But on the other hand, we seem to have more in line with this art of living, right? Where we're all living separately, conducting our lives in different kinds of ways. So it seems like this odd mixture of both. So I'm wondering if you want to think on your feet, and I'm not pressuring you to do it, how this distinction might be applicable today to people who are philosophers, but who do not totally share a way of life, but then do share things that seem like we have the material conditions and the practices for a way of life.
Well, okay, so I think like you that, well, if by philosophers you mean academic philosophers, we do have a bias indeed, and it would be hypocritical to deny it. I think perhaps we don't want to admit it out loud, but we are privileged. We have the luxury of scholé. And yes, they are constrained to academic life, but quite frankly, would you exchange it for something else? No, me neither. So we share a bias in terms of having freedom of thought, freedom to use our time mostly as we wish, and to dedicate our whole life to knowledge. This is incredible. Anyways, I appreciate it. An art of life, I mean, we would need this, I think in the contemporary context, is the personal initiative. What could it be? I mean, what could it be? If you subscribe to an ancient recipe, I guess you could, like, there are people who identify as Stoics, say, or there could be other things, but this is totally personal initiative, I would say. I don't think we share an art of life. We share a bias, but I don't see us share. I don't see what it could be. Do you see something that all of us? I don't think so. No, let's think about it.